I'm not one that says I told you so, but we are seeing the resurgence of chaos, supply chain issues, and problems. And these won't be solved probably till the end of 2022. My concern now is overreaction. I'm seeing companies, 2022, is it going to be the year of anti-lean and inventory? You're going to, in your own inventory, you will see mix issues probably because of what's going on. People shifting demand, people pulling back from items they did want that you already have on the water. You're going to see the secondary market flooded because of some of these mix issues, because of inventory coming in late. It's going to flood the secondary markets. You're going to see discounts and pricing being pushed lower. At the same time, pricing is caused higher. We got the perfect storm coming for the beginning of 2022. Be ready for that because cash will become king. You will then you start managing inventory. Let's get to it. Welcome. Another episode of IBF On Demand. Your master of foresight and predictive host, Eric Wilson. You can find me at eric@ibf.org, eric@ibf.org. Thanks for the follows and subscribe. Find me on LinkedIn, YouTube, wherever you get your podcast. Thank you, Arkiva, driving business transformation by solving what others cannot. Thank you, Arkiva, the sponsor. Everything you saw in the intro was actually from last October, November, which probably recorded in last September is when we've been talking about this. We are seeing the perfect storm right now. I've been shouting it from the rooftops for close to a year. It's not that I'm any smarter than any of you. Trust me, I guarantee I'm not smarter than most of my audience out there. I'm not a genius. What I did so was patterns, and you can see them too if you just look to see what's going on around you. I actually talked about this back in 2016 in my book Cultural Cycles, which talked about what is going on right now. I called it the Great Reset back in 2016, and I talked about a 35% decrease in the markets from top to trough, which we possibly may be going into right now. So this isn't rocket science. This isn't what's going on right now. You can see the warning signs going on right now for what we're getting ready to come. And what I want to recommend, IBF membership. We talk about IBF membership. One of the advantages of IBF membership is you have actually access to what other people are saying. People who are smarter than I am, talking about what is getting ready to come. I'm not the only one talking about this. The Journal of Business Forecasting. We actually have an economic outlook that comes out at the back of every Journal of Business Forecasting. You're going to get that as a member. It talks about what is getting ready to come the next quarters as far as economic outlooks. We have research, industrial trends to see what trends may be accelerated through these times as well. You can have access to. So check that out. We also have town halls with great guests like the guest we're getting ready to have today. Town halls that really focus on what we're seeing and having your questions answered as well. So check those out at ibf.org. As I mentioned, one of those great guests we're actually going to be talking today is Dean Sorensen. Dean is a management consultant with a unique mix of strategy, financial, operational experience across dozens of manufacturing companies in a variety of industries. He's the founder of IBP Cooperative and helps organizations understand and leverage business practices and technology. He was an editor of International Institute of Forecasters. He has a prior long history of consulting from companies such as Accenture and A.T. Kearney, focusing on finance, strategy, performance management. He actually has practitioner experience as a finance and operations experience as well. He's a longtime supporter of IBF and actually speaker as well. Help me welcome Dean. Welcome, Dean. I'm excited to have you on my podcast.
I'm excited to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah. Now, I wish I had you on a year ago because I've been talking about this now for the past year, kind of shouting from the rooftop of what's coming. And a lot of S&OP processes, even though they've gone a lot of advancements during COVID, they still maybe not see what's coming next. So I'm glad I'm having you on so you can help explain to the audience exactly what may be coming and what's maybe missing in an S&OP process right now that they need to start focusing on. So I'm excited to have you part of this. Let's start off with FP&A, which some people may be familiar with. I know you're very familiar with S&OP, IBP, some of the different acronyms, but what's the major difference right now between FP&A from a financial perspective and what we're seeing in most S&OP processes today? What's the big difference?
Um, well, first of all, I think, if you look at S&OP, S&OP is really a process, and if you include IBP, they're really focusing on, supply chain costs or supply chain resources, right? And in most companies, that really represents what anywhere between 50 or 60% of your cost structure. So one of the things that obviously FP&A is really focused on is 100% of the cost structure. A operationally savvy finance guy would acknowledge that you can't possibly get a good cash flow forecast with a manufacturing model. It just doesn't work. You know, if you don't have a lot of changes in volume and mix, perhaps you can get away with it. But the minute things start getting complicated, you can't really run an effective FP&A process without bills, routings, and a supply chain tool. It just doesn't work. Um, so those are parts that aren't working. And of course, that the other part is what I call the other part of the cost structure, which is, in my view, is really kind of falling between the cracks of both FP&A and S&OP, and that's the overhead cost structures. So one of the things that uh, you know in um, in FP&A, those tools, they support kind of driver-based planning, and they're very simple drivers. And I think that, again, the more that you look into it, the more complex things get. Is that these tools are really uh, like overly simplistic. And I think that as somebody who's done a lot of cost management or cost reduction projects, one of the things that you inevitably find is that these traditional overhead rates and traditional costing models that companies use, just they're wrong. So they just give you the wrong answer. And we've known that for like 30 years. What we haven't really acknowledged is the fact that the planning models are also wrong. So that a lot of the financial models that are used in FP&A tools, just they're giving you the wrong results. So if you've got wrong costing, it's really a symptomatic of bad wrong planning models as well, right? You can't have one without the other. When your financial processes are still structured around charts of accounts, you can't help but sub-optimize. It doesn't work. Um, and the consequence of that for this one particular company was that because they were planning in silos, we found somewhere between 500 million and $1 billion of sub-optimized resource allocation because of it. And I think those sorts of things are still kind of falling between the cracks of finance and ops.
Okay, so I think you kind of alluded to this then, but if there's that much missing information that finance needs, or S&OPs really not showing the big picture of what's happening inside the companies and health of the organization, what is some of the perspective finance has on S&OP? What's their perspective of S&OP process? Are they on board? Do they see the advantages of it?
Well, I think it really depends on who you talk to. So personally, one of the things that I do in my work, I'm typically dealing with companies who've probably already done S&OP, they've done FP&A, they've done ABC, you name it, they've probably done it, and they're stuck. And one of the things I think you'll find is that when you get into companies who've been doing this for a while, the finance guys become a little bit more operationally savvy. So I'll give you a classic example of a guy I'm working with right now, and I would say that this guy is probably just as strong in S&OP as he is in FP&A. In fact, in his new role, IBP is actually reporting to him. And you know, um, one of the things watched one of your webinars or your podcasts earlier with Debbie. I forget her last name, but
Crimer, Debbie
Kramer,
Crimer.
right,
Yep.
right. So she was talking about like what's in it for finance. So to me, like he has a number of the same perspectives that I do. Like personally, I see absolutely no difference between S&OP and a rolling forecast. It's exactly the same process, perhaps at different levels of aggregation. The leading indicator of these processes is an accurate cash flow forecast. One of the reasons why cash is so important is that it tells you if you're going to do it really well, you've got to understand how resources are being consumed. If you don't understand resource consumption, you can't possibly get cash right, which is one of the reasons why, if you look at 99.9% of global manufacturers, really struggle with cash flow forecasting. It's really hard to do when you don't have the right models. So, and again, you need to have really good models to do that. And just getting back to this um, one gentleman I'm working with, the other thing that he sees as a big benefit of kind of looking at it more holistically is that if you look at S&OP and IBP processes, there are so many redundant and non-value activities spanning between the two. So one of the things that we did, we just stepped back and said, well, what should the process look like? But if you kind of step back and look at the process as a whole and then design it that way, you're just going to see it differently. So it's not that the 5-step process, I think, it's not that it's out of date. I think it's missing some steps. So if you kind of step back and look at the process more holistically, you're going to eliminate a whole bunch of things. And like I said, for this one gentleman, one of the things that he sees is he's not going to need as many FP&A people. He's not going to need a separate S&OP process. He's not going to need a separate decision support process. There's a whole bunch of really good reasons why one would want to have an integrated process that's where you've designed it, uh, in an integrated way right from the very beginning.
So what you mentioned was a finance-led S&OP, and actually IBF research has shown that finance-led S&OP is not only going to have lower forecast error, but better plans, better results as far as the bottom line across the board, being able to have a finance. So our research actually supports that from a finance-led S&OP. But one of the things you said in there was a fully integrated S&OP, which I thought was key. So it's not just FP&A, product, supply, demand. It's an integrated S&OP. What does that fully integrated S&OP look like?
One of the biggest problems that companies still have is that we still haven't fixed the functional silo problem. If you look at FP&A tools, they're all functionally driven. And I'm actually writing an article right now entitled, "Is FP&A software killing your strategy?" Because if you look at, all these FP&A tools, they're all like that. And I know the entire market, so there's not too many that aren't thinking this way. So what's one of the things that's missing is what I call productivity management. So looking horizontally across the business, if I want to look at my order to cash um, process, for example, I want to know, is it costing me $10 an order or $5 an order? And one of the reasons why you want to do that, you've probably heard of the book Beyond Budgeting, that kind of
Mm-hmm.
thing. And one of the things they talk about is, the bad behavior caused by budgets. The problem is that neither rolling forecast nor S&OP have fixed that problem. So people are still focused on, meeting functionally based budgets. If you want to get them away from that, you've got to replace it with something. So rather than focusing people on fixed budgets, I want to focus them on somebody who owns the order to cash process. I want you to hit $10 an order or $50 an order or whatever I think it is, and those targets may um, vary by segment, but that I want them focused on relative financial targets. That is an absolute must, because one of the things that happens if you don't do that, and this happens when you don't kind of think about these processes together, are something called unwritten rules. Things like never submit your real budget the first time, always under promise and over deliver. Now, think about that one. If you look in a demand planning process, how much forecast error is in there because somebody's monkeying around with the forecast? It happens all over the place. Like I talked to a guy, and he was raving about his IBP process. He had been on multiple, podcasts and webinars talking about how good it was. And, I was talking, he thought it was kind of world class. And then I got to this issue of unwritten rules. He said, "Oh, yeah, I probably spend half my time dealing with that." So I'm thinking, I'm not sure if I would really call that world class. So to me, one of the biggest problems that companies have is they can't connect targets to outcomes, right? What do I want to achieve? What's it going to cost me, right? So that's one thing. Um, the other component is I think companies are missing is they can't actually manage what I call these trade-offs. So you remember, I mean, one of the things in S&OP, we talk about trade-offs between, production costs, inventory levels, and customer service. Well, those trade-offs exist everywhere in an organization, like absolutely everywhere. So in order to cash process, the trade-off is going to be between cost per order, perfect order fulfillment, days and receivable. So when you ask somebody who owns that trade-off, what you're going to find is that nobody owns it. The reality is that if you can't manage those trade-offs, you really don't have a formal mechanism for optimizing performance, right? It doesn't exist.
Okay. You mentioned, I think the third one in there, and you've mentioned cash a few times. I mean, I
Yeah.
know going forward, a lot of organizations, cash is once again going to be king. We're going to, in the environment we live and going towards, we're going to start hearing inventories, cash be brought up a lot more. I know in a lot of S&OP processes I look at for organizations, they miss the cash flow forecasting. They when they're looking at optimization, they're looking at cost and service, and they really look at inventory as just a target, not really a variable in that optimization problem. Do you see where cash flow forecasting? I know I see it. I'm sure you do, as far as being missing in a lot of S&OP processes right now, and having that visibility to what exactly it means by cash.
Hmm. Yeah, I do. I do. It's missing in both FP&A tools and S&OP. So
So it's not
again,
just S&OP. The whole company's
no.
not really has that full visibility to what cash outlook's going to be.
Yeah, one of the problems in you got to look at FP&A. It like in the manufacturing sector, it's just an entirely different animal, right? So the reality is that in a small company, you can get away with using averages and things like that. But the minute that if you're a 10 or $20 billion company, there's no way that you're going to do a cash flow forecast without what I would call a supply chain model. I'm not sure how I would do cash flow forecasting without this model. I see zero difference between a supply chain model and a cash flow model. It's the same model. Because if you have, changes in volume and mix and price, you can't possibly maintain that model in an FP&A tool. Not possible. So anybody who thinks they're going to buy an FP&A tool and do cash flow forecasting is fooling themselves. It doesn't work. Again, you can use averages, but if your objective is to manage the performance of the company, I'm not talking about just doing external reporting, but I mean, ultimately, what you really want to have is understanding cash flow by business segment. That's really where you want to get to, right? And as much as you can, you want to be able to understand resource consumption, cash flow by business segment. In my view, the only way that you can do that is by a forward looking activity planning model. Now, I don't want to scare people away with that. Now, I don't know if people have really kind of realized this, but a supply chain model is nothing more than an activity planning model, right? We make products, we ship products, we, receive and produce, all those. It's just at a fairly granular level of detail, but the foundation for that is activities, right? And then we have these, fairly sophisticated supply models that understand the relationships between all these things. Those flows is what provides the foundation for highly effective cash flow forecasting, right? Because if you don't understand the flows, what the flows give you is what I call more of a dynamic planning model, right? So you have a change in an upstream activity, automatically flows down to a downstream activity. And you can fairly easily quantify how that impacts cost and cash flow. That ability to simulate how different transactions and flows, and I think the flow is a real important thing, affects your cash flow and your income statement is something I think most companies really need. And I think if you look at most FP&A tools, they're not even remotely close to having that level of sophistication in terms of being able to drive it. Because when you get into bigger companies, when you're trying to do all this stuff on averages, it doesn't work. Not to mention the fact that if you're really trying to leverage analytics, like one of the things that really kind of um, I find quite interesting is that one of the things that FP&A tools are really talking a lot about is predictive analytics. But the one thing you won't see them talking a lot about is prescriptive analytics, like the supply chain tools. And the reality is that I think that every finance guy is just really going to want a prescriptive analytics tool, because if I'm a treasurer, I want to know how any scenario we're looking at is going to affect my cash flow, my working capital, my foreign currency exposure, my debt exposure. And oh, by the way, when we're running scenarios, I also want to know, am I going to run into any debt covenant issues, that kind of stuff. FP&A tools aren't even remotely close to something like that. Not even it's not even in their radar screen. And I'm not going to say for all, but when they talk about analytics, I think that this intersection between finance and ops is probably one of the least understood, especially in FP&A. But it's really an area that I think that big companies are struggling with, because you know they're complex companies, and you
Mhm.
need a level of sophistication to deal with that complexity.
So one of the things that you mentioned, as far as the income statement versus the balance statement and balance sheet, and unfortunately, I see a lot of S&OP processes or supply chain. We focus very heavily on the income statement side of it. Activity based, costing. I mean, it's really what activities can we eliminate and how can we reduce cost. Everything's a cost reduction type of activity that we're trying to do. What is the benefits of looking at the balance sheet? And we talk about cash is king. Why is it going to be king? And what are the advantages of looking at the balance sheet in addition to the income statement as well?
Well, I think if you force yourself to look at cash and the balance sheet, it leads you to a different level of thinking in terms of how you structure your processes. Because like I say, you can't get away with averages, and the minute start looking at balance sheet using kind of like average types of formulas, you're gonna see a whole bunch of errors. So I mean, one of the things is that, when I talk to some companies, one of the things they still get, for example, is surprises in their P&L, right? So we expected to hit this much cash, this much profit, and oh my God, it's way off. How could we possibly be that off? And what you realize is that the models that they're using are actually incorrect. But if you forced companies to really focus on cash, to get cash right, if that was your only focus, it would force you to do things so differently. That's why I think one of the biggest things that both CFOs and CEOs can do when they're launching an IBP project, all they need to do is specify one thing. You need to get me free cash flow correct. What's more, you need to get it correct um, by business unit. I need to understand, like if I'm running a business, I want to know what's the value of my company, right? So I want to know um, each of those business units, what are they worth. I also want you to make sure that any changes you're introducing to that company are driving is increasing my free cash flow. So if I have a new product, if I have a new customer, if I have a new supplier, so like classic one where, customer comes to you, you have a new customer, I want you to do this. And so it's a new product. Traditional world, one would go and, develop a price for it. And it may not meet the customer's price. But and maybe actually that it'd be easier for you to utilize a product that you already have, even though it doesn't meet their so-called target price. But when you look at cash, you avoid the fact of you don't have to get a new supplier, you don't have to manage the product, you don't have to, your forecast accuracy is probably going to be higher because you're going to have less variability with greater volume, that kind of thing. So when you start looking at cash, you look at things differently.
I think companies better start working on it soon, because if the last 2 years were really, focused on supply chain and a lot of light was shined on what needs to happen in supply chain, I think the next year or so is going to be on finance and cash and what shortcomings it has and what it needs to do to start being able to plan better going forward as well. And there's great people like you out there that can actually help them. So hopefully they reach out to you, and hopefully companies will actually start heeding some of these warnings you're talking about now.
Well, I think there's a lot in it for them to do it. I think that, this topic has been addressed in different ways in terms of what company or what some are calling the cost of complexity. And the numbers are actually pretty big in terms of what these processes are worth. So, if you look at the cost of complexity being anywhere between kind of 3 to 5% of sales, and really complexity costs, that example I gave you of, a new product. So the right decision might be sell the existing product and take a lower margin on it, but produce higher cash flow, as opposed to the wrong decision, creating a new product, which is going to destroy cash flow. That represents the difference between the cash flow in those two options really represents the cost of complexity. That cost of complexity is costing some companies anywhere between 3 to 5% of sales. And I like I say, I think the numbers are there as kind of somebody who's, worked with prescriptive analytics and activity-based costing. What you're really trying to do is avoid the decisions that cause these complexity costs. And like I said, if anybody out there who's done an activity-based costing project and seen the value that they've gotten out of it, really what a really good process ought to do is prevent those things from happening in the first place. And I think that one of the things that most companies are experiencing is that, they have difficulty, even when they reduce costs, they have difficulty sustaining these cost reductions. So I think that the more they think holistically and step back and look at it from a broader perspective, the better off they'll be.
Well, hopefully, it's a lot what you had to talk about there. And hopefully what you did was kind of inspired people, frightened some people, and hopefully informed some people that they're going to get some more information. Check out your webinars you have and some information you have as well. And hopefully, people learn from where they're at and where they need to be from this as well. So I want to thank you for being part of this podcast.
Well, appreciate you having me on, and thanks for the opportunity.
I want you to listen closely. We have the perfect storm coming. And most likely this is going to be replayed midway through 2023. I hope not. I hope I'm wrong. I hope I'm making mistakes here and this forecast is incorrect. But guess what I see? My opinion, purely my opinion. Opinions of this is Eric Wilson, not those of IBF and other people. But this is my opinion, what I see coming. We will have a recession. I don't see a way we can avoid it at this point. We will have a recession. Spending will be contracted. We will see spending decrease. It will cost significantly more to borrow money, both individuals and businesses. Businesses will start struggling with the money they've already borrowed and new money they need to borrow in the future. Inflation will continue. We still haven't seen the full impact of the trickle down of cost of fuel and other types of cost. Salary increases, those are going to be fed into the markets. We're going to see inflation continue as well. As a result, inventory will cost more, and A lot of companies are going to have a lot more of it than what they want. Margins will be razor thin, and you're going to see a lower top line growth at the same time. Revenues will be down. Costs will be up. Cash is going to be harder. We will be in a situation. We're going to hear words like covenants, borrowing power, inventory problems. You're already seeing that happen today. It's going to be exacerbated in the months to come. All these companies will not make it out of this. We're going to start seeing problems, and you need to get ahead of it right now. I tell you what, it's not a good picture, but
the members of your podcast that are listening in from a forecast and analytics standpoint actually have the opportunity to help lead the way out of this.
You're going to play a critical role in having those insights. You need to start looking critically right now at what's going on. Look at external variables to try to explain what's happening right now. Bring those into your forecasting process. Don't overreact. Make more adjustments more frequently. All the things we talked about past episode about how to deal with the data at COVID. Go back, check out that episode. Those are relevant today and relevant now, especially what we're going through. I couldn't have said it better myself. You are potentially the solution out there. Every business decision is propagated on a forward-looking projection, i.e. a forecast. We need to start looking at what we're projecting forward and having honest conversations inside your organizations. You need to make sound predictions and be as transparent as possible. You need to work on collaboration, bringing multiple views into it and having those type of outlooks as well. You need to build consensus inside your organizations and operate off the same outlooks. Even if it's not the prettiest picture going forward, you need to build consensus of what may be to come. You need to focus inside your organizations on what you can control. And don't wait to understand not only the cost and the service, but the cash as well. Look at balancing that triangle. Go back to some of the podcasts I had with Brahm. Look at his book, understand the implications of that triangle and on your strategy, but truly understand the implications on cash. We focused on a lot of that on this podcast. That's what really is going to become king in the future. Understand the really cash flow and cash forecasting going forward as well. Align it to your strategy. And most importantly, things will not be the same tomorrow than they are today. Be willing to adapt. Be willing to adapt your strategy. Be willing to adapt what you're looking at, what's happening, what's driving your business. All those things may change over the next year. Be willing to adapt going forward as well. Well, I'm going to go back and read Cultural Cycles and see how this all ends. It's a great book. You can find it on Amazon. But if you really want to know some good news, it's actually in this book as well. It's not what's happening right now. I said I wrote this book in 2016 talking about what we're going through now. It's really about what's going to happen next year and 2 years from now, where this cycle takes us next. That is potential good news to look forward to. My name is Eric Wilson. You can find me at eric@ibf.org, eric@ibf.org. I want to thank Arkiva, driving business transformation by solving what others cannot. And thank IBF as well for being in the forefront and providing this content, providing all the other content, providing the research that they do on trends that's happening, providing the town halls to inform you from subject matter experts, much smarter than I am, of what's going on. Looking at, as far as the Journal of Business Forecast, the economic outlooks at the back of each of those. We're doing our part to provide you as members of what's going to happen. So consider being a member, keeping informed of what's happening now and what's going to happen in the future. So the one thing that has not changed in my podcast from day one and still wise advice today, don't forget, wash your hands. Everything we're talking about in these podcasts, guess what? The reason we've been talking about it, because it is important going forward.